Warden Marcus Harrison arrived at Millfield Federal Correctional Institution every morning at 6:30 a.m. sharp, just as he had for the past 18 months. At 52, he moved with deliberate precision, though most staff saw only a mild-mannered administrator who preferred paperwork to confrontation. The maximum security facility housed 2,400 inmates, many violent offenders serving long sentences. Millfield had a reputation for being well-run and secure, with low incident rates and minimal violence. Harrison had been hired specifically to maintain that reputation after the previous warden retired under mysterious circumstances. What the Department of Corrections didn't advertise in Harrison's official biography was that Colonel Marcus Iron Fist Harrison had spent 25 years in Special Forces, rising through ranks to command elite units in Afghanistan, Iraq, and classified operations in places that didn't appear on official maps. He had earned his nickname not for brutality, but for unwavering adherence to military justice and maintaining discipline in the most chaotic circumstances. Harrison had retired from the Army after a distinguished career, including 2 Bronze Stars, a Silver Star, and commendations for operations that would remain classified for decades. When the prison warden opportunity arose, he saw it as a chance to apply leadership skills in civilian service while continuing to serve his country. The transition hadn't been easy. Military command and prison administration required different approaches, different relationships with subordinates. In the Army, Harrison's word was law, backed by military regulations. In prison, he managed complex bureaucracy filled with union employees, civil service regulations, and political considerations. But Harrison had adapted, as he always did. He had learned to work within the system, building relationships with staff and earning respect through quiet competence rather than military authority. Guards appreciated that he didn't micromanage their operations. Administrative staff liked his efficient budget handling. Inmates respected his fairness but firmness. For 18 months, the arrangement worked well. Millfield remained one of the most stable facilities in the federal system, with low staff turnover and minimal incidents among the inmate population. Harrison had found new purpose in managing the complex logistics of keeping 2,400 dangerous men confined safely and humanely. That changed on a Thursday night in November. Harrison was working late in his office, reviewing budget reports for the upcoming fiscal year, when he heard something unusual coming from the lower levels of the prison. It was after 11 p.m., well past lights out, and the facility should have been quiet except for the skeleton crew of night guards making their rounds. But what Harrison heard sounded like shouting, not angry voices of inmates fighting, but excited cheering of a crowd watching something entertaining. Harrison's military instincts kicked in immediately. Unusual sounds meant unusual activities, and unusual activities in maximum security were always cause for concern. He locked his office and made his way toward the sound, moving quietly through corridors he'd memorized during his first week on the job. The noise was coming from Sub-Level B, an area housing the prison's old workshops and storage facility. Most of these spaces had been abandoned when the prison was renovated 5 years earlier, but they remained accessible to staff with proper keys. As Harrison descended the stairwell, sounds became clearer, men shouting, dull thuds of impact, and underneath it all, the unmistakable sound of money changing hands. Harrison had heard these sounds before, in back-alley establishments in Kabul and Baghdad, where soldiers went to blow off steam in ways that weren't officially sanctioned. Someone was running a fight club. Harrison approached Sub-Level B using techniques he'd learned in urban warfare environments, moving silently and using cover to avoid detection. The main corridor was dimly lit, but light spilled from an open doorway about halfway down the hall. Harrison positioned himself where he could observe, without being seen, and looked into what had once been the prison's automotive repair shop. What he saw made his blood boil. The workshop had been converted into a makeshift arena. Folding chairs surrounded a cleared area where 2 inmates were fighting, not the desperate, wild fighting of men defending themselves, but the practiced, brutal combat of trained fighters putting on a show. Around the perimeter, about 30 men watched the fight with intense interest. Harrison recognized most of them, prison guards, supervisors, and even a few civilian contractors, Money was changing hands openly as they placed bets on the outcome. But what made Harrison's military training kick into overdrive was the realization that this wasn't a spontaneous fight between inmates who had grudges to settle. This was organized, systematic exploitation. The two fighters showed signs of previous beatings. Their hands were wrapped with professional tape. They moved with the exhausted determination of men who had been forced to fight repeatedly, not the fresh aggression of men settling a dispute. This was gladiatorial combat, and the guards were running it for profit. Harrison watched long enough to identify the key players. Sergeant Tony Ricci, a 15-year veteran of the prison staff, appeared to be taking bets and managing the money. Captain Dave Miller, who supervised the night shift, was standing near what looked like a makeshift bar where guards were drinking alcohol, a serious violation of prison regulations. Most disturbing of all, the inmates weren't just fighting each other. They were fighting for the entertainment of their captors, and the guards were treating them like animals in a cage. Harrison had seen enough. He quietly retreated from the area and returned to his office, his mind already working on a plan. In the military, Harrison would have called in backup, surrounded the area, and arrested everyone involved. But this situation required a different approach. These were his employees, people he worked with every day, people who held the lives of 2,400 inmates in their hands. If he handled this wrong, it could destabilize the entire facility. More importantly, Harrison needed to understand the full scope of the operation before he acted. How long had this been going on? How many staff members were involved? Were inmates being coerced into fighting, or were they volunteers? Was money the only motivation, or was there something darker happening? Harrison spent the weekend conducting what he thought of as reconnaissance. Using his master access keys and knowledge of the prison's layout, he explored areas of the facility he'd never had reason to visit. What he found confirmed his worst fear. The Fight Club wasn't a recent development. The workshop had been extensively modified, with proper lighting, ventilation, and even a small medical station where injured fighters could receive basic treatment. This was a sophisticated operation that had been running for months, possibly years. More disturbing, Harrison found evidence that the fights weren't limited to the workshop. In several unused cells, he discovered what appeared to be training areas where inmates had been practicing combat techniques. The walls showed impact marks from repeated striking, and the floors had been covered with mats. Someone was training these men to fight more effectively, which meant someone was making serious money from their performances. Monday morning, Harrison began gathering intelligence on his own staff. Using his administrative access to personnel files, schedules, and financial records, he started building profiles of everyone who might be involved. What emerged was a picture of systematic corruption that went far beyond a simple gambling operation. Tony Ricci, the sergeant who appeared to be running the betting, had been working at Millfield for 15 years and had a reputation as a prisoner's guard, someone who bent rules to help inmates in exchange for cooperation. But his financial records showed deposits that far exceeded his prison salary. Captain Dave Miller, who supervised the night shift, had been written up several times for minor infractions, but had always managed to avoid serious consequences. His wife had recently purchased a new BMW that would have been difficult to afford on his government salary. Most concerning, Harrison discovered that several inmates who appeared to be regular fighters had been moved to specific cell blocks where they would be under the supervision of guards who were likely involved in the operation. This wasn't just about entertainment or money. This was about control, coercion, and the systematic abuse of prisoners who had no recourse and no one to complain to. Harrison realized he was dealing with a criminal conspiracy that involved multiple levels of the prison hierarchy. But he also knew that if he tried to handle this through official channels, word would leak and evidence would disappear before investigators could act. This situation required the kind of precision operation that Colonel Harrison had specialized in during his military career. It was time for the Iron Fist to come out of retirement. Harrison spent Tuesday and Wednesday conducting discreet interviews with inmates who weren't involved in the fighting, but who would have knowledge of what was happening. Using techniques he'd learned in military interrogation, he approached these conversations as information gathering sessions rather than formal disciplinary proceedings. What he learned made him sick to his stomach. The inmates weren't volunteering to fight. They were being coerced through a combination of threats, bribes, and manipulation. Guards would identify inmates who had fighting experience or physical capability, then pressure them to participate by threatening to make their time at Millfield more difficult. Inmates who refused to fight found themselves facing false disciplinary charges, longer periods in solitary confinement, or harassment from guards who could make their daily lives miserable. Those who agreed to fight received better food, access to contraband, and protection from other inmates. But the most damaging revelation was that some inmates were being drugged before fights to make them more aggressive or to mask injuries that would have prevented them from fighting. This wasn't just exploitation. It was systematic abuse that violated every principle of justice and human dignity that Harrison had spent his career defending. Thursday night, Harrison put his plan into action. At 10:45 p.m., he positioned himself in a maintenance corridor that provided access to sub-level B without going through the main entrance. He was carrying equipment that would have been familiar to his old Special Forces unit: night vision goggles, a digital camera capable of low-light photography, and a recording device that could capture conversations from a distance. By 11:15 p.m., the Fight Club was in full swing. Harrison documented everything: the betting, the drinking, the way guards encouraged more brutal fighting by offering additional rewards for dramatic knockouts. He recorded conversations where guards discussed which inmates were good investments and which ones were used up and needed to be replaced. He photographed money-changing hands and captured clear images of every guard and civilian contractor who was present. Most importantly, he documented the condition of the fighters themselves. Both men showed signs of recent injuries that hadn't been reported in any medical logs. They moved with the exhausted desperation of people who were being forced to perform for the entertainment of their captors. Harrison had gathered enough evidence to end the operation and ensure criminal charges for everyone involved. But he also knew that simply calling in law enforcement might not be enough. These guards would have time to destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, and possibly harm the inmates who had been forced to participate. This required a more direct approach. At 11:47 p.m., just as the main fight was ending and guards were beginning to settle their bets, Harrison made his move. He entered the workshop through the main door, moving with the calm authority of a man who had commanded troops in combat zones. The room fell silent as guards and contractors turned to see their warden standing in the doorway, but Harrison's expression revealed nothing. "Gentlemen," Harrison said in the same tone he'd used to address soldiers before dangerous missions, "I believe we need to have a conversation." The reaction was immediate and predictable. Several guards tried to move toward exits, but Harrison had positioned himself to block the main door. Tony Ricci attempted to hide the money he'd been counting, while Captain Miller tried to dump his beer behind a workbench. "Nobody move," Harrison continued, his voice calm but carrying the unmistakable authority of command. "Nobody leaves. Nobody destroys evidence." "Warden Harrison," Captain Miller stammered, "this isn't what it looks like. You were just forcing inmates to fight for your entertainment while betting on the outcome and consuming alcohol on federal property?" Harrison interrupted. "I have photographs, recordings, and enough evidence to ensure that everyone in this room faces federal charges." The two inmates who had been fighting stood in the center of the improvised arena, looking confused and terrified. Harrison addressed them directly, his voice gentler, but still authoritative. "Sit down and rest. You're not in trouble. Medical personnel will be here shortly to examine your injury." He turned back to the guard. "As for the rest of you, you're all suspended immediately pending a full investigation. You will surrender any contraband, including alcohol and money from illegal gambling. You will be escorted from the facility by federal marshals who are already en route." Tony Ricci finally found his voice. "Warden, you don't understand. This has been going on for years. The previous administration knew about it. We're not hurting anyone. These inmates volunteer to fight." Harrison's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes made Ricci take a step backward. "Sergeant Ricci," Harrison said quietly, "I'm a retired Special Forces colonel. I've spent 25 years dealing with people who lie to me, and I've become very good at recognizing bullshit when I hear it." He gestured toward the two exhausted fighters. These men have been coerced, drugged, and systematically abused for your entertainment. That's not just a violation of prison regulations, it's torture, and everyone involved will be prosecuted to the full extent of federal law." The room remained silent as Harrison continued. Federal investigators are already reviewing financial records, cell phone communications, and security footage. The Department of Justice will be filing charges for civil rights violations, conspiracy, and corruption. Those of you who cooperate with the investigation may receive reduced sentences. Within 30 minutes, federal marshals arrived to escort the involved staff from the facility. FBI agents began processing the scene as evidence, while medical personnel examined the injured inmate. Harrison spent the rest of the night being debriefed by federal investigators, providing them with the evidence he'd gathered and the intelligence he'd developed about the scope of the operation. By morning, the fight club that had operated in the shadows of Millfield Federal Correctional Institution for over 3 years had been completely dismantled. Special Agent Janet Torres, the lead FBI investigator, found Harrison in his office as dawn broke over the prison. "Colonel Harrison," she said, using his military rank rather than his civilian title. "Impressive work. We've been investigating corruption in federal prisons for months, but we never had evidence this comprehensive." Harrison looked up from the incident reports he was completing. "How extensive was the operation?" "Bigger than just your facility. We think there are similar operations in at least 4 other federal prisons, all connected through transfers of personnel and sharing of proven fighters. Your evidence has given us everything we need to take down the entire network." Torres paused, studying Harrison's face. "The Department of Justice is going to want to know how a prison warden was able to conduct this kind of investigation without any outside assistance." Harrison met her eyes. "I saw something that was wrong, and I used the skills I have to fix it. Sometimes, the simplest explanations are the correct one." 3 months later, the trials were over. Tony Ricci received 8 years in federal prison for civil rights violations and conspiracy. Captain Miller got 6 years. The other guards involved received sentences ranging from 2 to 5 years, depending on their level of participation. More importantly, the investigation Harrison had initiated led to the discovery and dismantling of similar operations in other federal facilities. 17 additional staff members were arrested, and comprehensive reforms were implemented throughout the federal prison system to prevent similar abuses. The inmates who had been forced to fight received medical treatment, counseling, and in some cases, reductions in their sentences as compensation for the abuse they had suffered. Marcus Harrison remained as warden of Millfield Federal Correctional Institution, but now his reputation extended far beyond his own facility. The Department of Corrections asked him to serve as a consultant on prison reform and corruption prevention initiatives. The Iron Fist had found his final mission, ensuring that justice prevailed even in places where it was supposed to be absolute. 6 months after the fight club was shut down, Harrison was conducting his evening rounds when he encountered inmate Rodriguez, one of the men who had been forced to fight. "Warden Harrison," Rodriguez said respectfully, "I wanted to thank you for what you did. A lot of us thought nobody cared what happened to us in here." Harrison paused in his rounds. "Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of what they've done. It's not negotiable." Rodriguez nodded. "Some of the guys are saying you used to be some kind of special forces soldier. That true?" Harrison considered the question for a moment. "I used to serve my country in a different way. Now I serve it here." "Well," Rodriguez said with a slight smile, "I'm glad you're on our side." As Harrison continued his rounds through the secure corridors of Millfield, he reflected on the path that had brought him here. 25 years of military service had taught him how to fight enemies of America overseas. But sometimes the most important battles were fought at home, in places where the powerful preyed on the powerless. The Iron Fist had learned that justice wasn't just about following orders or enforcing regulations. It was about standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves, even when those people had made mistakes that landed them in prison. Sometimes the greatest enemies of justice weren't foreign terrorists or enemy soldiers. Sometimes they were the people who were supposed to uphold the law, and sometimes the most important victories were won not on battlefields, but in the quiet corridors where nobody was watching. Colonel Marcus Harrison had found his true calling, ensuring that even in the darkest places, justice would always find a way to shine through.